Because all these things for everything, else.
Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Strategic International Studies. I'm Andrew Schwartz. I'm our Senior Vice President and Chief Communications Officer. So glad to have all of you here for this terrific panel or panels. One thing I wanted to alert you all to is we have this new podcast. It's called The Impossible State. If you haven't heard it, it's Victor Cha and Sue Terry, Mike Green, Bob King, other experts here. I host it. It's all
Japan and the United States have requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council later today after North Korea fired a missile that flew over Japan. The missile flew over the island of Hokkaido before it crashed into the sea off the country's east coast. Well, the launch prompted an alert and people were told to take cover in basements or in concrete buildings. The Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, said the launch was an unprecedented, serious and grave threat to his nation. North Korea has fired rockets over Japan twice in the past, once in 1998 and again in 2009, but on those occasions Pyongyang claimed that they were satellite launches, not weapons. Just before midnight, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson tweeted that he was outraged by what he called North Korea's reckless provocation. Meanwhile, the Chinese government says the United States and South Korea are partly responsible for pressuring North Korea, questioning whether all parties were pushing for peace. Our correspondent Yogita Lamai reports on the latest North Korean missile launch.
Japan being woken up by a siren on Tuesday morning as a North Korean missile flew over the country. The rocket was launched from near Pyongyang and it flew over the northern island of Hokkaido before splitting into three parts and landing into the sea to the east. It's just the latest in a series of military missile tests conducted by North Korea this year, but a more serious one because it flew over Japan. The last time that happened was nearly 2 decades ago. Their outrageous act of firing a missile over our country is an unprecedented, serious and grave threat, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said. At a US base near Tokyo, a military drill was conducted by Japanese forces in response to the missile launch. Across the sea in South Korea, joint exercises are underway with American troops. They're held every August, and North Korea usually responds with a show of strength. Last year, it conducted a nuclear test in retaliation. This year, it's flown a missile that had the potential to cause serious harm. A strong message that despite international pressure, Pyongyang has no intention to stop. Yogdalamai, BBC News, Seoul.
And our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is in Tokyo.
You can imagine people waking up here to the sound of air raid sirens and being told to find shelter in concrete buildings or basements is not a normal occurrence for people in Japan. In fact, as far as I'm aware, I think this is the first time this has happened perhaps since the Second World War. People have been practicing the last few months in towns up and down the coast of Japan because of the increased number of missile tests by North Korea, but this is the first time that it's happened for real, that the public address system is being used to tell people there's a missile flying in our direction, find shelter. So this is a very serious and very aggressive thing for North Korea to do. Countries do not normally fire ballistic missiles across the territory of their neighbours, and that's why we've seen this very angry response from the Japanese government, from Prime Minister Abe, calling this an act of violence, saying it's unprecedented, and speaking to President Trump and them together, saying they will now take this to the UN Security Council and demand action from the world community, especially from countries like China and Russia.
Well, let's get reaction now from Beijing. Stephen McDonnell is there. Hello to you, Stephen. China saying that efforts towards resuming those talks over North Korea's nuclear weapons program have reached a tipping point as a result of this. Analyze that statement for us. How much friction exactly is there now between Beijing and Pyongyang?
Well, it's interesting. China, whenever there's one of these tests from North Korea, says that all parties should remain calm and that no one should do anything to escalate the situation. And we had that again today from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. But there was something else. They're really blaming the US and South Korea for pressuring North Korea into carrying out this test. And that's because, as we heard before, the US and South Korea are having these big war games. Now, China says the military exercises should stop in exchange for North Korea halting its missile program, at least halting the testing at the moment of the missile program. But China also says that the UN resolutions, apart from calling for sanctions, also call for all parties to move towards peace talks. And it's questioned rhetorically whether or not everybody, and it means by this the US and South Korea, whether everybody is really heading towards these peace talks.
Can China bring any more influence to bear, do you think, on North Korea and what it does next?
I think there's no doubt that China can pile more pressure on North Korea. I mean, it is the biggest trading partner by a long shot with North Korea, and everything that China does by way of sanctions hurts the DPRK. Now, China has said today it's going to maintain this sanctions program as long as it's agreed to the sanctions at the United Nations. But the BBC asked, for example, would they back more sanctions? And the Chinese government has said, well, that's a hypothetical question. We can't really say whether we would do that. But they've stressed they don't think sanctions are the answer and that really we need to move towards peace talks to provide some sort of long-term solution.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much. Stephen McDonnell in Beijing for us, and with me now is Professor Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Busan National University in South Korea. It's very good to have you with us. Diplomacy, sanctions, downright criticism and very strong words from some nations. None of this has stopped North Korea carrying out another missile launch. What do you think has prompted it to to fire this latest missile over Japan?
Sure. Thank you for having me. A couple of things. One, I think North Korea is probably more confident than in the past that these kinds of provocations, this is a pretty big one, won't be punished because North Korea is now a nuclear missile power. The governments around the world, the relevant governments, particularly South Korea, Japan, the United States, will not say that. Nobody wants to actually sort of formally put that in print. But, North Korea is here now with a nuclear missile, and there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. And I think that probably gives them a certain amount of confidence they can get away with more stuff. Also, the North Koreans like to provoke during the American-South Korean drills and exercises. There's a big one going on right now. It's called Vulk Freedom Guardian, and this is all about interoperability and scenarios for conflict with North Korea. The North Koreans claim that these are rehearsals for invasion. They're not, but the North Koreans like to sort of respond in some way, and missile tests have sort of been one of their favorites. So this is something we kind of expect. Not this particular thing shooting over the islands, but something is pretty typical.
So do you think that sanctions just aren't working?
No, actually I don't. And I think the sanctions sort of get an unfair rap on this. I think the proper counterfactual for sanctions is not, well, they shouldn't have a nuclear program at all because the sanctions work well. It's rather, how much worse would the nuclear program be if we didn't have sanctions? That is to say, you hear people kick around that they might have 50 or 60 warheads now, well, maybe they'd have 200 if we didn't have the sanctions. So I would argue that the sanctions should stay in place. We need to start going after North Korean money, particularly North Korean money in Chinese banks. I think that's sort of the big goal out there. But no, we shouldn't let up, and we should keep going back to the UN Security Council. I mean, there's really no good kinetic options, right? Talking to North Korea is probably not going to work. We should try that too. I don't really see much choice but to continue to do what we're doing, which is the UN and missile defense.
Okay, so let's explore that a little bit more. What do you think the response is going to be from South Korea, from Japan, which beyond the rhetoric has traditionally, kept a relatively low profile on this matter? What do you think the response is going to be this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's really sort of on Japan now to sort of find some kind of way to respond to this, right? As your correspondents previously pointed out, North Korea's only done this twice before. This time it really was sort of obviously a ballistic missile that what the previous ones were too. But this really is about terrorizing Japanese civilians, and it's hard to be a serious government without some kind of response. If I had to guess in Japan, this will really improve the positions of hawks in Japan who want missile defense. Japan does not have, for example, THAAD battery, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense battery, which now exists in South Korea to protect against these kinds of strikes. I would imagine there'll be pressure in Japan to get that too. In general, I think this is sort of the strategic race in Asia you'll see in the next decade or so with North Korea. As the North Koreans build more missiles, there's going to be an increasing amount of pressure for missile defense, and so you'll get a kind of arms race around that.
And in terms of resuming any sort of talks over North Korea's nuclear weapons program, what of that route? Does that stand any chance of any success?
Yeah, probably not. The North Koreans have put a huge amount of money into getting a nuclear weapon. North Korea's GDP is only about $35 to $40 billion, considering, depending what statistic you take, right? That's really not a lot of money for a program this complicated. I've heard numbers thrown around as high as 8% of GDP has gone into this program, so they're not going to give it up without some massive concession, and it's just not one the United States is going to give. The United States is not going to unilaterally pull out of South Korea or something like that. Right, so the talks probably won't really go very far. We should keep trying. Maybe we can get some small concessions. We may make small changes. But we've been talking to North Koreans about their nuclear program since the early 1990s, and it's always been sort of two steps forward, then one.
Manson has been serving his time at prison in Vacaville, California, isolated from his fellow inmates. Manson's first television interview since the murders begins badly.
Japan and the United States have requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council later today after Japan. The missile flew over the island of Hokkaido before it crashed into the sea off the country's east coast. Well, the launch prompted an alert and people were told to take cover in basements or in concrete buildings. The Japanese minister said the launch was an unprecedented, serious and grave threat to his nation. North Korea has fired rockets over Japan twice in the past, once in 1998 and again in 2009. But on those occasions, Pyongyang claimed that they were satellite launches, not weapons. Just before midnight, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson tweeted that he was outraged by what he called North Korea's reckless provocation. Meanwhile, the Chinese government says the United States and South Korea are partly responsible for pressuring North Korea, questioning whether all parties were pushing for peace. Our correspondent Yogita Lamai reports on the latest North Korean missile launch.
Japan being woken up by a siren on Tuesday morning as a North Korean missile flew over the country. The rocket was launched from near Pyongyang and it flew over the northern island of Hokkaido before splitting into 3 parts and landing into the sea to the east. It's just the latest in a series of military missile tests conducted by North Korea this year, but a more serious one because it flew over Japan. The last time that happened was nearly 2 decades ago. The outrageous act of missile over the country is an unprecedented, serious and grave threat, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said. At a US base near Tokyo, a military drill was conducted by Japanese forces in response to the missile launch. Across the sea in South Korea, joint exercises are underway with American troops. They're held every August, and North Korea usually responds with a show of strength. Last year, it conducted a nuclear test in retaliation. This year, it's flown a missile that had the potential to cause serious harm. A strong message that despite international pressure, Pyongyang has no intention to stop. Yogita Lamai, BBC News, Seoul.
And our correspondent Rupert Wingfield Hayes is in Tokyo.
You can imagine people waking up here to the sound of air raid sirens and being told to find shelter in concrete buildings or basements is not a normal occurrence for people in Japan. In fact, as far as I'm aware, I think this is the first time this has happened perhaps since the Second World War. People have been practicing the last few months in towns up and down the
何あれなんか変なもんだね。ロケットだね。怪しいね。
何ちょっと怖いよ。
なんだろうなんだろう
怖いよ。
ちょっと変なもんだね。なんだろう
怖いよ。
UFO みたいなもんだけど、ロケットみたいなもんだよね。
怖いよ。
怖いね。
ねえ、上からなんか降ってこない？
なんだろうなんだろうちょっと待って、ちょっと待って。俺取っとかなくちゃ。
怖いって。
I just my biggest right trouble. I thought that big. Like from private sector, like I from India sector 3, man. You're not even supposed to know I'm here. That I work. What? Don't worry about what you're doing. There's no line to that work. Don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing. That's a good point. Code 14.
怖いね。
何あれ？
怖いね。
ねえ、原爆じゃないの？
なんだろうちょっと待ってわ。何あれ
お願い。
何あれ
お願いよ。
怖いね。ちょうどなんか月のとこ行くよ、ほら。
ああ、お願い、怖いよ。
なんだろうなんだろう
Testified before the China Commission about the progress China has been making in its civil and national security space programs. This issue is extremely important right now because we see China making a lot of advances, not only in its civil space program, most recently by landing a lunar rover on the far side of the moon, but also in its national security space efforts. And I testified in particular about China's counter space capabilities, where they are developing systems that are designed to disrupt, degrade, and destroy our space systems that we depend upon for national security and economic prosperity. The main point I was trying to make in my testimony is that we should have a multifaceted approach when it comes to China and space. We need to engage China on civil space programs. Simultaneously, when we're engaging China on civil space, we need to bolster our efforts to deter China when it comes to national security space. The most important thing we can do from a national security perspective is to improve our deterrence posture in space so that China is not tempted to attack us in space, and we can continue to enjoy the advantages that space provides us for national security and our economy. For more on my testimony and this critical issue, visit csis.org.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out here right before Labor Day weekend. I'm Jeff Nankoff with the Russia and Eurasia program here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion of Paul Schwartz's new report, which hopefully you got a copy of on the way in, Russia's contribution to China's surface warfare capabilities. We are at a moment right now where, as you all know, relations with both Russia and China are in a difficult spot, and I think a lot of us have been watching what that means in terms of developing bilateral cooperation between Moscow and Beijing. And that cooperation, of course, has accelerated in recent months thanks to the crises in the South China Sea and in Ukraine. But there are some structural features of this too, and it goes back in a lot of ways to before the start of these outbursts. And one of the ways that this cooperation has manifested itself has been an increased military and military technical cooperation between the two countries. It's an area where there was a lot happening a decade or so ago, and then dropped off for a while. And it's only in the last couple of years that we've really seen it resuming. And so it's been wonderful for us here in the Russia and Eurasia program to have Paul Schwartz on board as a non-resident associate to work on specifically the nuts and bolts of Sino-Russian military cooperation. And the first fruit of Paul's affiliation with us, the first concrete fruit of that is this report here. And so I hope you'll have a chance to read it, and I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have here today. I think what we're going to do is we'll have Paul discuss the report for about 15 to 20 minutes, go through some of the data, some of the conclusions, and then we're going to have a little discussion up here. And in addition to Paul, we have my CSIS colleagues, Thomas Carrico, who's a senior fellow with the International Security Program and director of the Missile Defense Project here, and then Zach Cooper, who is a fellow with the Japan chair and an expert on Asian security issues. Tom is going to talk about some of the political aspects, particularly as it affects the United States and U.S. responses, and then Zach is going to give a little bit more of a regional perspective, how Asia as a whole views Sino-Russian military cooperation. And then when they're done, we're going to open it up to discussion, and hopefully we'll have a good back and forth with those of you here in the room. So with that, please turn off your ringing devices, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Paul Schwartz. Thanks a lot, Jeff.
In 1996, Taiwan's then current president Lee Teng-hui was up for re-election. He had previously made statements indicating that he favored greater independence for Taiwan. Statements that had greatly disturbed China's leaders. Fearing that Taiwan might declare outright independence if he were re-elected, China's leaders decided that they needed to send a strong signal that Lee was taking Taiwan down a very dangerous path. So in March of 1996, they began conducting a series of live-fire missile exercises in the Taiwan Strait that disrupted maritime traffic. In response, the U.S. decided to act, so it dispatched 2 carrier task forces to the region. Faced with such an overwhelming display of force and lacking the means to effectively counter it, China's leaders were forced to back down to accept a humiliating defeat. It was no accident that just a few short months later they entered into their first contract for advanced Sovremeny destroyers from Russia. The Sovremeny being designed specifically to attack and destroy U.S. aircraft carriers. Nor would this prove to be a one-time event. In fact, would you be surprised to learn that since the Cold War, Russian defense assistance has been crucial to the development of China's surface and anti-surface warfare capabilities. Nor has this been solely an historical phenomenon that even recently, in fact over the last several years, in a few cases, Russian defense assistance has continued to play an important role in the development of China's maritime forces. Today, I'm going to lay out the case for this claim by addressing 3 related questions. First, what kind of defense assistance have the Russians provided for China's maritime forces? Second, how have those forces benefited from such assistance? And third, what has been the impact on China's anti-access strategy? In doing so, we're going to focus on the specific ships, sensors, and weapon systems that have either been transferred outright from Russia to China or developed by China using Russian technology. But first, let's start with a little background on China's anti-access strategy. Now, many of you may already be familiar with that, so I'm quite familiar, but a brief recap of its essentials will help to set the context and explain the fleet's role in that strategy. Over the past 200 years, China has faced the persistent threat of attack from the sea, first from the colonial powers, then the Japanese, and most recently from the U.S. Navy. But for most of that period, China lacked the effective means to counter those threats. Its Navy remained underdeveloped, its fleet was wholly incapable of matching up against an advanced naval adversary or maritime force such as the U.S. Navy. Nor did its fleet possess the capabilities to defend China's sovereign interests in its nearby seas. Why? Well, until recently, China's fleet has suffered from 3 major deficiencies. First, it lacked the maritime naval air defense systems needed to adequately protect the fleet against air and missile strikes from a superior adversary such as the U.S. Navy. This forced the fleet to operate close to shore where it could be protected by land-based air defense platforms. Second, the fleet also lacked the modern anti-ship missiles needed to defend itself against well-armed U.S. warships. Without them, its fleet could have no hope of really standing up against the U.S. fleet in a force-on-force engagement. Finally, the fleet lacked a robust anti-submarine warfare capability. This left its ships vulnerable to attack by U.S. submarines, even when operating close to shore. To address the threat of U.S. intervention, China developed its now famous anti-access strategy. As its name suggests, the strategy is designed to keep U.S. forces out of contested maritime regions in time of war. And it calls for dividing the Western Pacific into 2 distinct defensive tiers, as you can see on the chart. The inner tier runs from China's coast out to the first island chain, a distance of approximately 200 nautical miles. The outer tier extends that perimeter further out for a total distance of 1,200 nautical miles from China's coast out to what's called the second island chain. China's fleet is assigned different missions depending on the defensive tier involved. In the inner tier, the mission is to prevent U.S. forces from intervening in a future maritime conflict such as one involving Taiwan. But also in that inner tier, its fleet is tasked to seize and maintain local sea control to allow for the conduct of military operations over those waters, such as would be needed to conduct an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. In the outer tier, by contrast, the fleet's mission is primarily to be one of sea denial, at least for the moment, although that is starting to change as we see China starting to develop its blue water naval capability. But its mission to keep the U.S. forces from using that area as a base from which it can launch long-range precision strikes against U.S. forces or against the mainland itself. But getting the fleet to the point where it could carry out such missions has been a long and arduous process. It's required a near total overhaul of the fleet and remains very much a work in progress. In fact, when the new strategy was first adopted, China's defense industry remained technologically backward, underdeveloped, incapable of providing the kind of advanced military weapons needed to properly upgrade the fleet. China was forced, therefore, to turn to external suppliers, and Russia soon emerged as China's principal supplier. Why? Well, due to the Tiananmen Square crisis back in 1989, China had been placed under a comprehensive arms embargo from the West. So it needed to find new sources. Fortunately for it, at the very same time, Russian defense companies, finding themselves cut off from state defense orders in the economic chaos that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, had become desperate for revenues from arms sales to sustain their very existence. The net result? A long and sustained arms trading relationship between Russia and China that continues to this date. And you can see this on the chart. According to SIPRI, between 1992 and 2014, Russia's transferred over $30 billion in military equipment to China. And that probably significantly understates the true amounts, since SIPRI tends to track primarily the larger transactions. So let's take a closer look at Russian contribution. We'll start with surface warships. Then we'll talk about anti-ship missile systems, and then we'll close with air defense platforms. Among the first steps taken on China's long road to modernization, the purchase of 4 advanced Sovremeny destroyers from Russia. At the time of their purchase, the Sovremeny was far and away the best warship in China's fleet, and immediately provided several important benefits. First, the Sovremenies came equipped with Russian Sunburn anti-ship cruise missiles. These were the first truly modern ASCMs in China's fleet. They could fly at supersonic speeds of up to Mach 3.0, strike targets at long range up to 240 kilometers, and had great penetrating power. In fact, their proposed transfer created something of an uproar in Congress, where members urged the administration to try to block the transfer, which they tried, but they were unsuccessful in doing so. To guide the Sunburns to their targets, the Sovremenies came equipped with Russian bandstand radar systems. These advanced systems provide over-the-horizon targeting capability for the Sunburn and can surveil targets out to a range of 450 kilometers. According to naval expert Norm Friedman, they accomplish this by bouncing signals off of the troposphere. The Sovremenies also came equipped with advanced Russian Gadfly air defense systems, which was China's first true area air defense platform. Although its range was limited, it could provide protection for Chinese surface action groups and convoys out to a distance of up to 25 kilometers. Aside from the Sovremeny, the Chinese now build all of their own warships domestically, which is testament to increased self-sufficiency in the shipbuilding industry. But that should not mean that China's fleet has become totally self-sufficient or independent of Russian support. Far from it. For example, according to naval analyst Keith Jacobs, Russia's Jonke-2 frigate reportedly benefited significantly from Russian design and development assistance provided by its Severnoy Design Bureau. China's maritime forces also rely extensively on Russian technology for both long-range precision strike and maritime air defense as well. Let's examine these contributions a little closer, starting with precision strike. We already talked about the bandstand radar system, which was delivered with the Sovremeny. Well, the Chinese have now purchased dozens of these systems, and they're widely distributed across China's fleet, including on all.
Hey, movie lovers, did you can watch TV on your phone? Discover over 100 TV channels. Oh, did we mention it's free?
Alright, let's rock and roll, man.
Boredom is out. Freedom is in.
Mr. Fine.
What are you waiting for? Take out your phone right now and download the Pluto TV app. Never pay for TV again. So wait, what is it?
Dr. Castro, you traveled recently a lot through South America, Latin America. Do you find support for your ideas there?
Of course. I found a lot of support. Wonderful support. It admired me very much because it was more than that we believe to find. And like in Canada, we find support too in the public opinion. Thousands of people shook hands with me in Canada. Many people are very nice people. We feel that very much sympathies with the people of Canada. Like with the people of the United States, the other people in the United States is nice people too. With us, we have no difficulty with Canada.
You mean you have difficulty with the American Congress?
Yes, with some politicians of the United States.
Do you think the affairs about the Communist Party being revived here are valid?
Nah, that is only a false reason they use. But the reason are only the interests of some big company.
If you have an election here soon, would you allow the Communist Party to take part in it?
Our opinion is that our idea is that everybody has the right to think and to write as they want. That is a democratic principle. We have no reason to forbid any kind of opinion. Free opinion is a principle of democracy. That is the only reason for that we don't forbid any idea. And what you see here is absolute crime of free opinion, free rights, human rights, for everybody we're not afraid of any. Our idea, and we believe in our idea.
Do you think the communists could get control in the trade unions?
I don't think, because our movement has the control. The movement has the absolute majority party, and we are making a social, political disagree with the interests of the laborers.
Look at you. You always did things your way. You never were a fan of advice from strangers. Why should investing be any different? Robinhood is investing your way. Unlimited free trades. Welcome to the future of investing. Robinhood. Castro condemns the U.S. for supplying arms to the Batista government. He attempts to make peace with America.
I came here because I was invited for the creditors. What happened is that here you in the United States are accustomed to see government coming from our money. No, I came for good relation, for good understanding, for good economical relations. We are now poor people but in a rich country. What we want is to work in our rich country.
Our guest likes rifles and cigars. There's a very young boy. He took up a typical Cuban sport, the breeding of fighting cocks. It is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Fidel Castro. You have said, sir, that dictatorship is impossible.
if public opinion approves. Did not Hitler, Mussolini, and Perón have public support?
We are against all kind of dictatorship. We are against all kind of dictator. That is our idea.
Mr. Prime Minister, what is your impression of Vice President Nixon?
I got really a good impression of Vice President Nixon.
Nixon has a different opinion. While in Washington, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower avoids meeting with Castro. Instead, he sends Vice President Nixon to meet with the Cuban leader. Nixon's opinion of Castro? He needs to be watched carefully.
Robinhood is an investing app that lets you buy and sell stocks, ETFs, and cryptocurrencies, all commission-free. Getting started is easy.
No American journalist has come closer to
nuestro pueblo sus deberes, porque entiende que el enemigo es uno, el mismo que nos ataca a nosotros en nuestras costas y en nuestras tierras, el mismo que ataca a los demás. Y por eso decimos y proclamamos que con combatientes cubanos podrá contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier
I was engaged in this worldwide movement to really overthrow governments from Zanzibar to Salvador to Nicaragua, all over Central Africa. He helped in Vietnam, in Libya, in Algeria, in Syria. They had training camps for guerrillas all over Cuba and in different parts of the world. I don't think anyone has any idea of what a big thing Fidel's adventures and ambitions led him to in the 1960s and even into the 70s.
Y entiende nuestro pueblo sus
Fidel Castro spent most of his life at war with the United States of America.
He leaned forward,
Ran for election to Congress, vowing to clean up corruption. But in 1952, General Batista seized power in a military coup. His new regime was supported by America. Students took to the streets in protest, but were brushed aside.
Y ahora hay un gobierno que no está.
And now there's a government which is not even dressed in civilian clothes. It's a military government, where public freedoms are restricted, and where the only
Spring Honda. Save on a new Honda during the Honda Dream Garage Spring event. Start the new year off right in a new Honda from Spring Honda in Loma Linda. Stop by for a test drive or view all current offers online at springhonda.com.
No, すみません、今何時ですか？すみません、今何時ですか？ですか？ですか？ですか？すみません、今何時ですか？お元気ですか？お元気ですか？お元気です。元気です。元気です。こんにちは。こんにちは。こんばんは。こんばんは。さよなら。さよなら。お誕生日おめでとうございます。気合いパミュパミュ。大好き。とても可愛い。大好き。あなたはとても可愛いですね。What is that? You're very cute. I love you. お疲れ様です。早く会いたい。どうぞよろしくお願いします。どうぞよろしくお願いします。どうぞお願いします。大好き。私の絶対領域はとてもセクシー。よろしくお願いします。どうぞよろしくお願いします。どうぞお願いします。大好き。私の絶対領域はとてもセクシーです。Ti voglio bene. Ciao, bellissima. Per favore, un'altra bottiglia d'acqua. I think that's it, but it's probably not. But ciao. Ti voglio bene. Hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Te gusta mi banana? ¿Quieres un café negro con soya leche? I'm mucho cruz.
Yep, pretty much. Ich liebe dich.
Ich liebe dich.
Yep. I liebe dich.
We're in Germany. Ich liebe
Deutschland.
Ich liebe so fast. T'aimes, j'adore. Quand je t'aime, tu es mon tu. Tu es mon tu, mec. Mais det säger så smidigt.
¿Y el tenedor que lo vi? No, ahí así es. Se me doy.
here's your sandwich. It says, hey, do you want to take that 75 cents and make it an $8 sandwich? And I'm going to take that 75 cents and invest it for you. And then all of a sudden, you're investing and you don't even realize it.
Sometimes I think sitting on trains. Every step I get to I'm cooking night game. Everyone's a winner, we're making our fame. Bonafide hustler, making my name. Sometimes I think sitting on trains. Every step I get to I'm cooking night game. Everyone's a winner, we're making our fame. Bonafide hustler, making my name. Hit me on my banner, prepaid wireless. I can deliver like UPS trucks. Already going hard, just pumping that gas. No one on the corner has like a lighthouse. Hit me on my banner, prepaid wireless. I can deliver like UPS trucks. Already going hard, just pumping that gas. MIA, third world democracy. Yeah, I got more records in the KGB. So, no funny business. You already are.
Attention please, it's time to put away your computers.
park girls go round the outside, round the outside, round the outside.
I'm on the way.
Two trailer park girls go round the outside, round the outside, round the outside.
Guess who's back? Back again. Saying he's back. Tell a friend. Guess who's back? 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 Guess who's back?
Storm the back of the bank, bustin' loose like mugs. Top moves to Vulk out home with up his own. The back is after phones, ready to shoot anything that moves. On the tones from the blue, throwing mask on. Khakis ounce going, house shoes on. I'ma start it off skitching on the first one. It's all here was back. Heard me, hear me, heard that words go past the front door. Before you gotta show off your heart and soul with that eagle flow. Explode the watch your phone, the other bills phone. You know that mask in an all blue sweater, 2 pumps ready for a ride. Pull the weather, 6 hostages with a loss of oxygen. Wet as a river, 16 bricks to flip. After I flip these, the intense slow they itchy. I've been down with this twist since 86. Hyperactive with automatic snap and reaction. I'm sick of waiting. A 38, I'm jack up the day. Kick the door in for sure. Double 4 gram and I'm pain. Get ready to knock them off. Any stand they position the can. Telegraph the whole parameter. Paralyze anything that walks through the parameter. Cervical veins lacerated, lost the mission. Interrogated and operated, posted with pistols. Time for war. This is when the hearts explode. Take up the game. Cocking this box explode. I'm a marksman. Touch the death 10 steps. Draw and that's all. Into anything before. In the full war. Hard like a Concord jet. Oh, GPG 7 in the full war. This is when the hearts explode. Take the game high. Sparks explode. They all press and panic and then start skipping. Not giving up for all y'all. It's this for all my G's. My homies. Flipping birds and serving these. I'm with GMT in the licks. Alcohol up like bitch. Getting up off my dick. I got pistols, pills, acid, slime, crank, crystallized coke and lines. I don't give a fuck. Storm the back of the bank, bustin' loose like mugs. Top moves to Vulk out home with up his own. The back is after phones, ready to shoot anything that moves. On the tones from the blue, throwing mask on. Khakis ounce going, house shoes on. I'ma start it off skitching on the first one. It's all here was back. Heard me, hear me, heard that words go past the front door. Before you gotta show off your heart and soul with that eagle flow. Explode the watch your phone, the other bills phone. You know that mask in an all blue sweater, 2 pumps ready for a ride. Pull the weather, 6 hostages with a loss of oxygen. Wet as a river, 16 bricks to flip. After I flip these, the intense slow they itchy. I've been down with this twist since 86. Hyperactive with automatic snap and reaction. I'm sick of waiting. A 38, I'm jack up the day. Kick the door in for sure. Double 4 gram and I'm pain. Get ready to knock them off. Any stand they position the can. Telegraph the whole parameter. Paralyze anything that walks through the parameter. Cervical veins lacerated, lost the mission. Interrogated and operated, posted with pistols. Time for war. This is when the hearts explode. Take up the game. Cocking this box explode. I'm a marksman. Touch the death 10 steps. Draw and that's all. Into anything before. In the full war. Hard like a Concord jet. Oh, GPG 7 in the full war. This is when the hearts explode. Take the game high. Sparks explode. They all press and panic and then start skipping. Not giving up for all y'all. It's this for all my G's. My homies. Flipping birds and serving these. I'm with GMT in the licks. Alcohol up like bitch. Getting up off my dick. I got pistols, pills, acid, slime, crank, crystallized coke and lines. I don't give a fuck.
It's like a bad dream where you shoot someone but it doesn't have any effect on him. Like a monster movie where you can't kill the person.